Welcome back to Escalation. Today we are honored to have with us Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's former Minister of Foreign Affairs and one of the key figures in shaping Ukraine's diplomatic strategy during its most challenging years. As Ukraine continues its struggle against Russia's full-scale invasion, Kuleba has been at the forefront of international diplomacy, securing vital military and economic aid, rallying support from Western allies, and pushing for stronger global accountability measures against Russia. His tenure has been marked by tireless advocacy, bold strategic moves, and an unyielding commitment to ensuring Ukraine's survival and ultimate victory. Dmytro, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to reconnect. You gave me a very generous introduction, but let me first start by saying that it is only now that I realized that the title of your podcast is Escalation, and that is a very good idea. I think this is I perfectly get where you're coming from. I remember all our conversations about the toxic impact of non-escalation on approach that was pursued by yours and our partners. And yeah, you took it to the opposite side, and that's a good move.
Yeah, I was trying to remember the first time we've met, and I recalled a cold end of winter in 2021. I just started working as a minister. It was one of my first trips abroad. I went to Kiev. We met. Everything was frozen. I tried to jog that morning in Kiev, and I almost broke my leg. The mood was very different. Clearly, I mean, I don't think that we've ever had that sort of conversation like we had in 2021. We had a conversation about what is happening on the front, because the front was active. Russia was escalating back then. Really, how the world has changed. If you would look through the years that you worked, do you think that the escalation worked?
Well, unfortunately, it didn't. And of course, it's kind of bad for diplomacy when de-escalation doesn't work, because it means that diplomacy fails. Despite all the effort that was invested in preventing this war, but the lesson we learned, and I think the whole world should learn from what happened, is that it's not worth pursuing de-escalation if you come to the conclusion that the other side had calculated the risks and the price it is going to pay and still made the decision to wage a war. I believe this is the mistake that the West is mainly responsible for. I hate people thinking that Ukraine blames the West. There are good reasons to blame ourselves as well. But in this big scheme of things in the world, of course, pursuing non-escalation and de-escalation while seeing that Russia is building up, while urging everyone that the war is imminent, was a mistake. And unfortunately, Ukraine and the world, Europe and the rest, are paying for these mistakes.
You being there throughout the meetings, and now with the ability to advise yourself or kind of to recollect, do you think it was possible to do something differently?
Yes, but it should have been done way before the end of 2021. As early as winter, like the beginning of 2021, it became apparent that Russia has something on its mind. And its first military buildup along an amassing of troops along our border, which occurred in early spring of 2021, was already the moment when de-escalation should have been put aside, and Putin should have been told that this is what is going to happen if you proceed like this. Not in vague, abstract wording, like you're going to face the consequences you had never seen before. But this policy should have been set up in very specific terms. Of course, I can go deeper and say that Obama should not have let Putin seize Crimea and establish control in Syria, because basically by allowing him to do both of these horrible things, Obama emboldened Putin and convinced him that the West is weak and there is nothing the West can do. Or we can go deeper and say that Clinton should not have sided with Yeltsin and denuclearize Ukraine. Or we should go even further in past and say that Bush, the old, should not have urged Ukraine against independence, and it set this sense of suspicion towards Ukraine in the American foreign policy. I mean, we can go deeper and deeper, but I think that now looking back, I believe that as of early 2021, the war was unavoidable under this setting. And we could, and the West could have behaved differently with Putin and try to at least delay the invasion and buy more time to prepare for it, or if they had started earlier, to avoid it but they would have had to behave in a way that the West does not imagine itself speaking with Russia. This is the issue.
Dmytro, what you're saying is very interesting. You recalled all the number of events throughout your country's history that kind of lead to a suspicion that there's very little understanding to what actually Ukraine is, the geopolitical situation. So is it ignorance that guides the policy towards Ukraine?
You see, history hates ifs and coulds, right? And political analysis can be easily trapped in too many ifs and coulds. But since we are on a podcast and not in a meeting of EU foreign ministers, we have the freedom to hypothesize. Let me put it this way. If Ukraine had secured its independence in the interwar period, the way Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland did, and it would have been similarly crushed by the alliance of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The West would probably have had the same feeling of guilt and responsibility towards Ukraine as it had towards Baltic states. And it would have embraced us, exactly like you, in the aftermath of 1991, because there was a short period of time in the early 90s when we were in the same basket. But then, upon insistence of Moscow and as a big power play between Moscow and Washington, Ukraine was abandoned and left to Russia as a compensation for taking former socialist countries and Soviet republics into both EU and NATO. So the West had, in my view, the West had a feeling of guilt towards what happened to your independence, but we didn't have this interwar decades to make the West understand us and explain why we are different from Russia and why we should not be treated through the lens of Russia.
Do you think that changed now? Do you have a sense that this is changing?
I believe the West is catching up. When the West saw that Ukrainians and Russians are actually killing each other, it asked itself a question, well, maybe there is something different between them if they're doing so. And you could not frame it in the terms of a civil war, right? It was a clear war conflict between two nations and two states. So the West is definitely catching up, but there will be two kind of litmus tests for it, which is Ukraine's accession to the EU and Ukraine's accession to NATO. If we see that accession to the EU, which doesn't seem to be questioned, is delayed, then that will be a bad signal. It will mean that no one learns any lessons. If Ukraine's accession to NATO is put on hold indefinitely, that will also mean that the West wants to embrace Ukraine, but do not consider it as a part of itself.
In the context now, we are approaching a period where everybody is more and more talking about the peace plan, and President Trump has, well, at least it was leaked that there have been already conversations between him and Putin, that some sort of a deal is being discussed. Part of it has been made public, if we can trust it. If you look at that, right, do you believe that West has a chance to have a peace plan?
Well, having a peace plan is much easier than actually implementing the peace plan. And even when you put peace plan in place, when you start implementing it, keeping it alive, make it sustainable, is even more difficult than implementing it. So this is basically the rule here is the farther you go with the peace plan, the more difficult it gets. So we are today in the very early stage of very loud exchange of messages, paralleled with very quiet conversations, and it's more or less obvious where it is leaning to. But do I believe that Trump can compel both sides to establish something like a ceasefire? Well, in principle, I believe it is possible. Will it be possible to sustain the ceasefire? I believe it will be extremely difficult to do that. Will Trump end the war? I do not believe so, because this war will end only when Putin accepts Ukraine's independence and Ukraine's belonging to the West. And I don't see that coming. I don't see that looming on the horizon. So this is basically where we are. We all remember very well how Minsk process and Normandy format worked. I think there is zero reason to believe that a potential agreement, if it is reached, will work anyhow differently from the way Normandy and Minsk.
Could you explain a little bit how would Ukrainian population accept a peace plan that, for example, it goes against the interest of its people, at the very least, giving out the territory, so something like that?
No peace deal, unless it's like a full victory, will be fully embraced by the Ukrainians. You can read in the polls that they kind of become softer on territorial issues. It's not that the people are ready to give up the land, but they are ready to kind of put it on hold for some time. So first, no peace deal unless it's 1991 border will be embraced by Ukrainians. Second, the peace deal that will stabilize the situation and bring to an end fierce fighting along the front line and missile attacks will be tolerated by a larger part of the Ukrainian society, but will be questioned and criticized by the most patriotic part. If that deal does not fall, because Russia will keep violating it or will undertake offensives or strike in civilian and energy infrastructure, the number of people unhappy with the deal will increase at skyrocketing speed. Of course, I mean, we have to be clear about one thing: the more unfavorable peace deal will be in the eyes of the Ukrainian people, the more radicalized those who are ready to act against this deal will be. And that will create two grim opportunities. First, politicians who will sign that deal will literally put their life at risk. And second, we should have zero doubts that Putin, even if he enters into a deal, will cease its attempts to shatter Ukraine from the inside by feeding through social media, through his agents, feeding people's hatred towards the political class that had allowed this war to happen and then conceded too much at the negotiating table, which will pose a high risk for serious destabilization of Ukraine from the inside. So unfortunately, there are no rosy scenarios here. There must be Ukrainian political elites and Ukrainian society and opinion leader. They have to show a lot of restraint and wisdom in both negotiations, but even more importantly, after negotiations.
What do you think would bring Putin to a negotiating table? You mentioned, that he has to accept that he loses and that Ukraine is a part of the West.
In my view, the only reason why he might sit and negotiate is, first, his wish to outfox President Trump in a way that not to upset him. Because Putin and Zelensky both understand that you have to handle Trump carefully. And Putin may enter this game in order to pretend that he is negotiating, blame Ukraine for failures to reach peace, while continuing his offensive operations on the grounds and missile strikes. Because Putin has not come for part of Ukraine. He has not come for a land corridor to Crimea. He came for the whole Ukraine. And this is, in my view, the game he will be playing. And the second reason why he might be interested in negotiating is if he comes to a conclusion that the pause that will be established by a peace agreement or ceasefire agreement will allow him to benefit more from it than Ukraine. This is because he's not in a good condition anymore. So he needs to replenish and refurbish.
When it comes to, again, all kinds of ceasefires or peace period that would come after it, President Zelensky mentioned, and we all understand that without security guarantees, it's very difficult to imagine, that any sort of peace would hold. Do you imagine that without the U.S., security guarantees would work?
Well, I think we have to be clear with the terms we are using. What is security guarantee? Security guarantee is when
like real security guarantees, like
exactly.
Article 5.
Real security guarantee is when someone says, "Dear Russia, if you dare to attack Ukraine again, I will throw my own military force, into the battle and fight along with Ukraine. And this is where your last day will come." This is security guarantee. This is why NATO is a collective security organization, right? Everything short of that is either called security assurance or military technical assistance. So we have to be very, very clear here, because people should not be misled on this. People hear the conversation about security guarantees and they take it seriously. So I spoke with someone from who was involved in the first attempt of Ukraine to invoke Budapest Memorandum in 2014. And he told me that literally everyone in the political class and many people in the society believed that invoking Budapest would mean someone coming and fighting for us and helping us to expel Russians from Crimea. So we have to be very careful with this terminology, right? With definitions. So what we are talking here, if we are not talking about Ukraine's membership in NATO, we are not talking about a country or a group of countries saying they're going to fight along with Ukraine if Russia attacks again, then we are not talking about security guarantees. And then comes the second question: what kind of security assurance or military technical assistance can stop Putin? So if country A says, if Putin attacks you again, I will send 100 tanks instead of already promised 50 tanks, Putin will do his calculation and will instruct his people to produce 200 tanks. If the country A says, I will bring back my instructors on the ground in Ukraine so that their mere presence in the country will be a deterrence measure, Putin will instruct his people not to fire at the locations where these instructors or any kind of officers are stationed. So he's smart enough to play that game, and this is what the kind of what causes so much pain among the Ukrainians, because what we see is happening is that our partners are preparing to talk us into peace in return for nothing more than a promise to help if Russia attacks again.
So you don't see Western troops, or I would put it like that. Is there a country which you believe, a group of countries which could send troops to Ukraine as a actual security guarantee to fight alongside you?
No, I don't see that at this. First, the idea of peacekeepers is not feasible. I mean, we should not waste time on talking about it. And by the way, we had already been there between 2014 and 2019, when a lot of energy was wasted on talking about peacekeepers. Second, I don't see any country that is willing to send its troops to fight in Ukraine. Moreover, I don't see a lot of countries who are even willing to restore their on-the-ground presence, non-combat. And you remember very well our discussions with French and other colleagues when President Macron had presented the idea of sending non-combat troops to Ukraine, and how fiercely it was opposed and how it sunk in discussions. So even, it's good that Ukraine will receive more military technical assistance. But is this the sufficient price for a peace that will be deceived by Putin the moment he feels he can finish the job? I don't think so. I think Ukrainians learned the lesson of Budapest. The Ukrainians learned the lesson of the last years, and they will be very skeptical about this kind of security assurances.
Dmytro, but then we are talking, if I understand it correctly, about the possibility of very similar deal that was signed in Minsk.
Yeah.
Because there was a ceasefire with no security assurances, no security guarantees, nothing on the ground changed, and Putin just had some time to prepare for the next phase of war.
As I already said, I see zero reasons to believe that Putin will behave anyhow differently from the way he behaved during Normandy and Minsk. And there's one particular story from that period of time that must be remembered by everyone. So after spending a whole night negotiating, which was very uncommon for the German chancellor and French president, finally the deal was signed. And according to the deal, the ceasefire had to be introduced within 24 hours, and the city of Debaltsevo had to remain on the Ukrainian side of the line. And that city was being besieged right as negotiations were taking place. There was a fierce battle for it. And so the ceasefire, the real ceasefire, came in force only days later after Russia captured Debaltsevo. Even after signing the paper, after looking in the eyes of exhausted Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande, Putin still continued his offensive operation on the city of Debaltsevo, violating his own commitment in no time. And everyone swallowed it. Everyone was patiently waiting until Ukraine lost Debaltsevo. No one was listening to our screams and outcries. And once Debaltsevo was taken over and our army retreated from there, Putin said, and now we will play the ceasefire game. Because he needed a break after a major military operation on the ground. And the West said, okay, yeah, at least. And they told us, at least it works. So I don't want to be overly pessimistic. I just struggle to understand why Putin should behave anyhow differently this time.
What's your take? How important is Kursk in the possible incoming negotiations?
Well, it is important because if you look seriously at the list of arguments and leverages that both sides have, Ukraine has few. And again, let's put this way. Ukraine has less leverages on Russia than Russia has on Ukraine. And deep strikes and Kursk are two strongest leverages in Ukraine's hands. So I don't know what is the military kind of context and perspective of holding there, but politically, it is crucial to have this card because eventually the bargain will not be about square kilometers, saying, okay, you give me back 200 square kilometers here, and I give you back 200 square kilometers there. It will be about territories in a broader sense. And in that sense, it doesn't matter how big zone of Ukraine's control in Kursk is, it will remain a very powerful bargaining chip for Ukraine.
And we're seeing that there's some progress that has been made in that direction during the last couple of days as well. So it sounds like it could be a signal for those who are preparing for negotiations.
No, as I said last October in my column at The Economist, from now on, both sides, Ukraine and Russia, will escalate by all means available to them in an attempt to put themselves in the strongest position possible ahead of Trump seriously diving into the process. And then we will have a situation, if if both Ukraine and Russia escalate, and this is exactly what is happening, and Trump dives in, tries to settle, and fails, then he will join them and he will begin to escalate. And we will have all three escalating. So that will be fun, unfortunately.
We're out of de-escalation, clearly.
Yeah.
Could you, again, one of the questions that I've been asked, and I'm trying to ponder, which the question would just not sound very realistic, but then again, it doesn't go away, about Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons. Do you believe that's doable?
No. I mean, if I was a politician, I would have offered you a more opaque answer, leaving room for interpretation. But
Now you're a free person.
But I'm a free person, and I have the luxury of speaking the truth. And if I learned anything during this wartime diplomacy, it's that speaking the truth to the people is very rewarding in terms of keeping people aware of what is really happening and what is possible and what is not. Because lying to people or manipulating eventually will have detrimental consequences. Like, as an example, the promise that was aired by some officials in 2022 and early 2023 that in 2-3 weeks we will be drinking coffee in Crimea. This kind of things, it really misleads people and then puts you in a vulnerable position. Having the luxury to speak the truth, I can tell you that re-nuking Ukraine is no-go. It's a no-go. For a very simple reason.
Politically?
No, because Ukraine is neither Ukrainian elites nor the Ukrainian society are ready to become a pariah in international relations and make its own friends and partners turn their backs to them. So if there was a consensus in Ukraine, okay, are we ready to be like Iran or North Korea? Then it could have been entertained. I mean, the idea of renuking could be entertained. But I don't think this is something that anyone is ready to put himself to. So technologically, I believe it's still possible, but the West should not be concerned with the idea of Ukraine going back nuclear. The West should be concerned with the fact that if, as a result of its mistake and lack of resolve, Ukraine loses this war, the global non-proliferation regime is highly likely to disintegrate, because the lesson every sensible nation will take away from Ukraine's story is that nothing can save you except nukes. And today, deterring Ukraine from becoming nuclear is much easier than deterring 1,000 of countries across the world who decide to go nuclear and own their own nukes. Because they will see that nothing else helps.
But I think that it's a part of a very important debate. You see, the way that I structure the situation is that the whole de-escalation approach towards Russia's war against Ukraine is basically based on the principle of Russia blackmailing the West with the possibility of nuclear attack, and West kind of taking that in. So in this sense, Ukraine is probably a first victim post-Cold War to a nuclear blackmail. And at least in Europe, it definitely started discussion. About the same thing that you're mentioning about the proliferation. So can we really trust the nuclear umbrella if we allow Ukraine to be blackmailed? Yes, of course, Ukraine is not under umbrella. It is not under Article 5 and was a neutral country, so to say. But can we really trust if, for example, Russia suggests that it can strike Vilnius or Warsaw or some other city, in order to take Narva or some other tiny city in the Baltics? So it would be the same thing. And then what can you do? And countries like Poland or others might start thinking, well, maybe it's best to start arming ourselves with nuclear arms.
That's exactly what we're talking here about. But I think the fundamental difference here is this. The West thinks the following way. We should not inflict more damage on Russia because let's be clear. We should not do more for Ukraine because if we do, Russia will strike nukes. When it comes to Baltic countries or NATO countries, the argument is Russia will not strike nukes on Lithuania because they know that we will strike back. Whether they will strike back, this is an open question, but this is basically the fundamental premise, which brings us to a very sobering answer that they care less for Ukraine than for Lithuania. This is the fundamental thing. You commit to defend someone else and take the argument to the highest point that if you do this, I will reciprocate. Only when you have legal, moral, and political obligation, a sense of care and responsibility for the other. And the West doesn't have it when it comes to Ukraine. And this is the issue. And I would like to dissuade anyone who will interpret my words as being anti-Western. I am very pro-Western. I believe that Ukraine must be in the West, must belong to the West, otherwise we will be crushed. But I want everyone to reasonably assess where the West stands on Ukraine. And today, the problem with nuclear argument is very simple. Because if you accept from the very beginning that you are constrained by the threat of a nuclear strike by Russia, you immediately lose the whole war, the whole fight, because then Russia knows that it can do whatever it wants. This is the fundamental flaw with nuclear deterrence, and this is the first moment since the end of the Cold War when this theory of nuclear deterrence is challenged so seriously.
A couple of other questions as well coming from various representatives from United States. One of them is the idea that Ukraine should have a immediate election, post-ceasefire, immediately election. Where does it coming from, do you think? And why U.S. would start talking about it?
Yeah, so Putin always wanted to have a reset in Ukraine. And elections is one of the ways to achieve that. So he is interested in that. Some year and a half ago, some Republicans started making a similar point, saying that you need to hold elections even when you're at war. And they were referring actually to the case of US elections during the Second World War. And we were telling them that, guys, but the war was not fought in your territory. This is slightly different. Right? They seem to have heard us, to have listened to us back then. But now with the return of Trump to president's office, this idea has become mainstream. And this is where, I hate to say it, but this is where US and Russia's interests align. So this is more or less on the origins of the elections topic. And let's see how it plays out.
When do you think, realistically, in your mind, when the elections should be held?
Elections should be held according to the law, following the lifting of martial law in Ukraine.
So that means that it has to be peace.
After the war. Yes, there must be sustainable peace. But again, the irony, or no, it's rather the sarcasm of the situation, is that we ended up exactly where we were in 19. Which in 19, the main conflicting issue was Steinmeier's formula. A formula proposed by then Foreign Minister of Germany that described when elections should take place in order for breakaway territories of Donetsk and Lugansk to be able to reintegrate in Ukraine. And all sides were fiercely fighting about Steinmeier's formula, thinking in discussions on how OSCE is going to monitor these elections or not, and what will be the criteria for recognizing them legitimate. And now we're approaching the moment when we will be drowning in another discussion about elections. Elections, ceasefire before elections, a ceasefire after elections, who will monitor, how will be votes counted, what Russia should do, what Russia can do. It's exactly the same conversation we've had 5, 6, 7 years ago. So amidst a completely different background in terms of the number of losses and destruction inflicted. And the fact that our partners are making these circles is very disappointing.
One of the other things that I find frustrating, actually, when leaders, in some cases religious leaders, say things about the war, about Ukraine, and they seem so far detached from the reality on the ground that it almost leaves you speechless. And the last was the Pope Francis. In his conversation, again, he had a conversation with Ukrainian young people where he asked Ukrainians to reject the war, embrace peace, and and become brothers again with Russians. I'm always wondering, because I'm frustrated as Lithuanian. I'm far removed from Ukrainian emotion, but what you would say to Pope if you had a chance?
Well, I didn't hear this particular words you're referring to him, but that resembles pretty much what he had said before. Listen, he is following in the footprints. I was going to make a joke, but then I thought making jokes about the Pope is not the best idea. So he's following in the footprints of George Bush, the old one, who came to Kiev in 1991 and delivered his infamous Chicken Kiev speech, urged Ukrainians to reject independence, embrace Mikhail Gorbachev and the idea of the new Soviet Union, and make friends and stay friends with Russia, with the Russians forever. I mean, it's the same. Again, everyone is making circles. And this is hopeless. Pope should be a beacon of hope, but he speaks as hopeless Western politician. So, but anyway, I mean, he has a judge. And that judge is not me, it's God himself. And I'm sure he will have, when the moment comes, he will have a very serious conversation with God on Ukraine. And God will have many questions to the Pope.
Okay, Dmytro, my last question. So it might be rather difficult upcoming weeks or months diplomatically for President Zelensky. If you would be able to give an advice, what advice would you give right now?
I don't think he needs my advices. He is a very skilled politician, diplomat, because he leads Ukrainian diplomacy as the president. He knows perfectly well what he is heading to, and I can only wish him strength to handle very unfavorable circumstances. And then when it's all over, and one day it will be over, of course, this will be the moment for questions, to ask questions and seek answers of how did we end up here, whether we could have avoided ending up here, whether we could have done better, not only in the course of the war, but in the years preceding the war. So we will need a very serious conversation inside of Ukraine, because we need to learn these lessons in order not to repeat the same mistakes. But today, I believe the president should be supported. His success will be the success of the whole country. That's what we have to hope for.
Well, thank you so much. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава, and let God continue to support us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Gabrielius. It was great catching up. Bye-bye.
Yeah.